Hey there, I'm Osman Faruqi, host of The Drop, a weekly culture show from The Age and the Sydney Morning Herald. Every episode, I'll be breaking down the latest in the world of TV, film, music and pop culture, with the help of some of the best writers and critics in the country. Sometimes we go deep.
There's a thrill in seeing what's meant to be private out publicly.
But mostly, we have fun.
I love her asking Logan for a selfie and saying, congrats on the deal, ka-ching!
And there's never been a better time to start listening to The Drop. Right now, we're breaking down every episode of the final season of Succession. Follow The Drop with me, Osman Faruqi, in your favourite podcast app.
From the newsrooms of the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age, this is Please Explain. I'm Samantha Selinger-Morris. It's May 3rd. Last week, American President Joe Biden announced that he will be running for a second term in office.
This is not a time to be complacent. That's why I'm running for re-election.
Biden, now 80, is already the oldest American president in history. If he wins the presidential election next year, he will be 86 by the time he leaves the White House. His political rivals and even some of his supporters are now asking the same questions.
It almost is all about his age and his ability to do the job again.
How old is too old to be president? At what age is a person still fit to be the individual with the nuclear codes? Today, Peter Harcher, political and international editor of the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age, on whether Joe Biden's age could determine his political future and how other world leaders have been embraced or rejected as they entered their 9th decade. So, Peter, you've been covering international politics for nearly 40 years. Is it rare to have a presidential nominee in their 80s?
Well, for the US, yes, absolutely. It's the oldest that the US has ever had. Political leadership in the US has been aging in recent years, and it's not just the nominees. I mean, Nancy Pelosi, Donald Trump, none of them are young, and America is actually going against the trend in democratic countries. And there's a difference between democratic countries and dictatorships. In the last 50 years, in developed countries, on average, political leaders have been getting younger. The average has been falling at roughly the rate of 1 year on the average age every decade for the last 50 years. So in the last 50 years, the average age has come down by about 5 years. And in the US, it just keeps going up.
Yeah, right, okay. And so tell me a bit about the dictators you mentioned.
Well, the fascinating thing is that the difference between a dictatorship, well, I suppose there's a few differences between a dictatorship and a democracy, but dictators hang on longer and are in office later, and on average, a dictator is about 6 years older than the political leader of a democracy. It's just a fact. For example, China, it has been common in China in the communist era for leaders not to even get the job until they were close to 70 or at the age of 70 or so. And today, Xi Jinping is 70. In fact, the world is ruled by old men. If you put together, and this is a digression, but if you put together, you've got Xi Jinping, he's 70. You've got Narendra Modi of India, is 72. Put that together with Putin, who's 70, and in the US, and you come to just a little over half the global population is ruled by men of 70 and older.
So why do dictators tend to get the job when they're, much older, and why do they live longer?
I think they hang on to power longer because it's the nature of their systems. It's harder to get rid of them. But, there's a fascinating fact that's little known, Samantha, that there's scholarship that shows that when a man takes on political power, it actually changes his physiology. I've had some pretty frank discussions with quite a few prime ministers over the years, and it does charge them up. The adrenaline, the challenge, it does charge them up. And you'd have to suspect in the case of these old guys that rule dictatorships, it keeps them going longer.
So interesting. So to Joe Biden specifically, the headlines asking just how fit he is to be president because of his age actually started in earnest in November when he turned 80.
An MRI, a cognitive test. Now listen, Tucker, I know 80-year-olds that are operating still. We know 90-year-olds who are amazing. But it's not about age, even though most Americans say he's too old to run again. I say it's about fitness, Tucker.
And a CNN report in February revealed that focus groups held last year showed that voters constantly bring up Joe Biden's age as a matter of concern.
86 years old at the end of his second term. So it's not a surprising thing that the president's age is a central topic of discussion, not just...
They think he must be ineffective or be something of a political puppet. Voters even use terms like brain dead, mush, and dementia.
So harsh.
I know, when
That is
expressing
awful.
their concerns. So in your experience, who tends to be better leaders historically? Young ones or old ones? And is there an optimal age for a leader?
Yeah, that's a toughie. You know, I think maybe those voters in those focus groups are... Well, let me put it this way. If the greatest criticism of Joe Biden is his age, probably tells us he's not doing too terrible a job as president, if that's his greatest vulnerability. And, you know, I've talked to people who have had dealings with Biden, including, by the way, our Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, who's had several meetings with him already. And we're not talking about handshakes in the hallway. We're talking about sit-downs at quad meetings, extensive bilaterals. I said, you know, what's the story? How does Biden strike you? Does he struggle? Does he need cue cards? And Albanese said to me, he's sharp as. And I talked to one bloke, an official who works for Biden in his 60s. I asked him the same question. I said, you know, how is it? Can Biden keep up? Does he have his naps in the afternoon? And this guy said, you know, we are all younger than him and we struggle to keep up with him. Again, maybe it's the power thing. Maybe it is maybe it keeps them going. Is there an optimal age? I think it might be the wrong differentiator to apply because there are world leaders who are terrific in their older years and world leaders who are terrific in their younger years and there doesn't seem to be a hard and fast rule.
Right, okay. And I'm just curious, do any stick out? Are there any leaders, say that were particularly young when they were either inaugurated or when they were sort of in the height of their powers, who were really good or really bad and vice versa?
Well, in Finland, Sanna Marin, she's the youngest, she's 37, and she gets some pretty good press. Now that Jacinda Ardern is gone, Sanna Marin is the progressive saint of the progressive side of global politics. But on the other hand, there have been older leaders, Winston Churchill, to whom we probably owe the liberties we have to speak freely today, Samantha. Now, Churchill, when he took the prime ministership during World War II, he was 66. Now, that's not an extremely old leader, but it's over the age at which the physiological evidence is that cognitive function starts to be impaired. The physiological evidence is that the age of 60, you start to get your executive function impaired, although it's selective in how it manifests between different people. So if that rule had been applied, for example, to Winston Churchill, if there'd been an age cutoff at 60 or 65, if he hadn't been in that job at that time, who knows what would have happened to the fate of liberty and fascism in our planet at the moment.
We'll be right back.
Hey there, I'm Osman Faruqi, host of The Drop, a weekly culture show from The Age and the Sydney Morning Herald. Every episode, I'll be breaking down the latest in the world of TV, film, music, and pop culture, with the help of some of the best writers and critics in the country. Sometimes we go deep.
There's a thrill in seeing what's meant to be private out publicly.
But mostly, we have fun.
I love her asking Logan for a selfie and saying, congrats on the deal, ka-ching!
And there's never been a better time to start listening to The Drop. Right now, we're breaking down every episode of the final season of Succession. Follow The Drop with me, Osman Faruqi, in your favourite podcast app.
So it's no surprise, of course, that Republicans are having an absolute field day with Joe Biden's age.
Top news right now. Amidst growing concerns over the mental abilities of President Joe Biden, former White House physician Ronnie Jackson has demanded that either the president should undergo a cognitive screening test or withdraw from the 2024 presidential race he recently joined.
Texas Senator Ted Cruz said that Biden is, quote, plainly diminished, far below the threshold needed to be a functioning and effective president, unquote. And right-wing media coverage of the classified documents found earlier this year in Biden's garage made him out to be possibly senile to explain why he hadn't remembered what happened to the documents. And then in February, Republican presidential hopeful Nikki Haley called for a mandatory mental competency test for politicians over 75 years old.
In the America I see, the permanent politician will finally retire. We'll have term limits for Congress and mandatory mental competency tests for politicians over 75 years old.
And she was referring to both Joe Biden and to Donald Trump, who's also vying for the presidency next year, and he's 76. So do you think politicians over the age of 75 should sit a mandatory competency test?
I think they sit one already, Samantha. It's called running for election. I don't think there's a better way of subjecting them to a competence or a cognitive test than the grueling process, at least in democratic countries, that politicians have to go through to become prime minister or president. I really think that's the best function. And that was just a sneaky way of differentiating her age and saying, I'm so much younger. I think, rather than a practical sorting mechanism.
Okay.
And it would be so undignified as well, requiring the competitors for the national leadership to set a competency test in public.
Joe Biden is trying to re-steer the narrative about his age by selling himself as being seasoned, wise, a man in his prime. That's what he said at the White House Correspondents' Dinner on the weekend. And he even joked about it at the dinner by poking fun at Fox News and CNN.
You might think I don't like Rupert Murdoch. That's simply not true. How could I dislike a guy who makes me look like Harry Styles?
So good. Because, of course, Rupert Murdoch is 92. So how do you think this strategy is working for Joe Biden?
Well, and there's a great case study. Nobody's suggesting Rupert Murdoch at the age of 92 has lost his marbles. I think it's the best possible way to handle it. Self-deprecating humour, you tend to get people laughing along with you. Second, it shows that he's sharp enough to joke about it.
Yes.
And at that White House Correspondents' Dinner, the moderator said something like, say what you like about Joe Biden's age, but after his nap, work gets done. And to laugh along with that sort of stuff,
yes,
I think is the winning strategy. What's the alternative? To start producing medical test results or to get indignant? They're both losing strategies.
It does remind me of what I think has gone down in history as one of the most famous instances of a politician joking about his age to deflect away from it, which was Ronald Reagan was in a debate, I think, against Walter Mondale. And I think the issue of Reagan's age was brought up because I believe he was in his 70s. And he said something along the lines of, I'm not going to use this man's age against him, by which he meant I'm not going to use his youth against him.
Yes.
Which is
interesting. Brilliant.
Which is brilliant. But it's interesting, though, because it sort of leads us to wonder about the issue of mental competency because, of course, Reagan famously, after he left the White House, he was diagnosed with Alzheimer's, and then the questions sort of were raised. Well, were there signs of this during his second term?
Well, I can give you a case study in that. So when Reagan was president, he hosted Bob Hawke, who was the Australian Prime Minister at the time, at a state dinner. And my sources for this are the Australian officials who were with Hawke at the dinner. And this is a little bit poignant. It's a little bit sad, but it's also a funny story where during the dinner at some point, Ronald Reagan started to tell a story about where he'd been flying in an Air Force fighter jet and he'd encountered the enemy during the Korean War. And he gave a very graphic and gripping, apparently, account of how he'd fought some aerial dogfight and downed the enemy jet, and very dramatic story. And at the end of it, one of my sources, an Australian official, leant over to the American official sitting next to him and said, I didn't realise the president had fought in the Korean War. And the American replied, he didn't. Oh. Reagan had recounted a movie role that he'd played, and he'd apparently lost the ability to tell the difference between movies he'd played and reality. So he was obviously already suffering from what was later diagnosed as Alzheimer's when he was president. Colin Powell tells a story. He told me that when he was the military officer assigned to carry the nuclear, so-called football for Reagan.
And just to be clear, the nuclear football is what exactly?
The nuclear football is the mechanism by which a nuclear attack is activated. It's got the red button.
Oh my gosh, okay.
Inside the briefcase.
Wow.
One night, Colin Powell, in his military uniform, carrying the nuclear football, walks with Reagan to Reagan's bedroom, and then his job is to salute goodnight and then sit outside the room with the nuclear football in case anything should happen. And as Reagan is turning to go into his room and say goodnight, he pats his pockets and pulls out a laminated piece of cardboard and looks at it for a minute, and then he hands it to Colin Powell and he says, "Oh, here, son," he said, "maybe you better have this," and hands Colin Powell this laminated sheet of cardboard. It turned out that the laminated sheet of cardboard was the launch codes, the nuclear launch codes. And of course, the president is not supposed to give them to a military officer who wasn't even a senior rank at that point. So Powell recounted that he said, "Well, thank you, Mr. President, but I think you better keep that," and put it back in Reagan's pocket, saluted him good night, and then took his post sitting outside the president's bedroom.
I mean, that's heartbreaking, but it's also terrifying. Do you think he made any decisions when he seems to have been had already developed signs of Alzheimer's disease? Did it impair his function? I mean, besides doing these things which are obviously problematic and could potentially have resulted in a catastrophe and didn't, is there any suggestion that he did anything?
He almost certainly would have made decisions which he wouldn't have made if he were completely compos mentis. And yet, through all of this, we have to remember, and the Colin Powell anecdote is a perfect illustration, these people, political leaders, rarely make a solo decision. They lead systems and they're surrounded by people, and decisions have to be taken in a systematic way, usually, unless you're Donald Trump, I suppose, and then enacted systematically. But again, the system protected the US and the world from a lot of Trump's more erratic decisions simply because he didn't know how to exert power in a way that transmitted some of those decisions into reality. So I suppose we should be grateful for the fact that our leaders are surrounded by people who restrain them from some of their worst, or in this case, most demented impulses.
So how much of the controversy around Joe Biden's age do you think can be put down to the way we view older people in our society? In other words, how does ageism factor into this debate?
It's a fascinating question, and it's a double-edged sword, because I think it is just straight out ageism to take that as not just a way of describing or categorizing and maybe handicapping a leader, but the sheer mockery of it. That's a bit of fun, but it's also ageism, and it's a bit offensive, and I'm glad Biden doesn't seem to take it too personally. The other fascinating fact, Samantha, is that when a country has an older leader, it actually, over time, improves the status and perception of older people in that society. There's now a body of academic work that supports this. So maybe over time, if Joe Biden, can win re-election, maybe he'll change perception of old people in America, and old leaders will become, well, I suppose they already are, a bit of a fad.
Thank you, Peter, so much for coming back to Please Explain.
Pleasure. Anytime, Samantha.
Today's episode of Please Explain was produced by Chi Wong. Our executive producer is Ruby Schwartz. Please Explain is a production of The Age and the Sydney Morning Herald. If you enjoy the show and want more of our journalism, subscribe to our newspapers today. It's the best way to support what we do. Search The Age or smh.com.au/subscribe. I'm Samantha Selinger Morris. This is Please Explain. Thanks for listening.